welcome back. This is Dr. Richard Herbold, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about the Paleolithic diet. So when you look at from whence we came, depending on your opinions and depending on what it is that you believe in, evolutionary, we know that from whence we came, kind of eating nuts and seeds and twigs and things on the forest floor, and if we were quick enough to track down something that moved quickly and put it into a pot or eat it raw, that was kind of the background in the beginning of time in which we survived as a developing creature. So the Paleo approach, or that caveman approach, is really looking at the core quintessential from whence we came of how we take care of ourselves from an eating process. So there's a book called Eat Right for Your Blood Type based on looking at the evolution of blood typing. So type O was the oldest blood type that we know of, and type O blood type, according to Peter D'Adamo and his father before him, was the Paleo approach based on the appropriate nature of fuel with our blood typing. Now, whether or not you believe that to be the case, that having been said, this Paleolithic approach is really trying to emulate what it is that our genetic information and our physiology in consumption resonates the best at. And I truly believe in doing clinical nutrition and working with clients for almost 40 years that a paleo approach is probably the most practical and logical way of looking at the ability of our physiology to use food as fuel. So food is fuel. Food is also pleasure. Most people don't really want to think about food as fuel, but the reality is what you put in will express itself in how you look and how you function. So I always talk about in my office allergenicity and glycemic index, and this is a long conversation that I'm just going to touch on, but for instance, if in fact you have an allergenic exposure, the Paleolithic diet is a great way to wean out things that potentially could be allergenic to you before we try to reintroduce those. The glycemic index is a little bit beyond the paleo discussion, but if you were to really look at this from whence we came, proteins and carbs and fats, which are the macronutrients that we consume, are always part of a discussion, including the Paleolithic approach. So if you're talking about vegetables and protein, which is particularly what paleo supports, no grains for most people. Some people can actually metabolize grains better than others. But from a sensitivity or an allergenicity, the paleo approach or the paleo autoimmune approach, which is more what we embrace in the office, is really looking at proteins, carbs, and good quality fats. And it's how we're designed to eat. The problem is the food choices and the convenience of restaurants and markets allow us to consume things well beyond just that as a template. So what I mean by that is shopping the periphery of the market, which tends to be less of the junk and more of the core foods, is probably a better way to address things. The paleo approach, once again, as far as simplicity, is proteins and carbs and good quality fat, and that's pretty much what it boils down to. Now, the composition of the amounts of that is dependent on your personal physiology. So somebody with a paleo approach who's a high-level athlete needs a lot more carbohydrates than somebody using a paleo approach for weight loss. So the complexity of the paleo approach is not necessarily just the food choices, but that's what I talked about before or alluded to, the glycemic index. The glycemic index is your tolerance to carbohydrates, the combinations and macronutrient combinations of proteins and carbs and fats in a plate of food, and the timing of eating these, including when you exercise, is part of the art form of figuring out what is optimal for you. So in a scale of people who are more reactively hypoglycemic, meaning that their blood sugar is too low, or insulin resistant, meaning their blood sugar is too high, the reactive hypoglycemic patients tend to be longer and leaner, get shaky and irritable between meals, and the insulin resistant patients, or those patients who have more of that blood sugar resistance, are the people who can go hours or days without eating, but then crave sugars and sweets all the time. So just understand the Paleolithic approach in my office, the way I interpret things, is a great core way of addressing most people's needs as far as fuel. And then the intervention of taking that fuel and twisting and tweaking that based on, we actually measure metabolism in the office with a device called electrical bioimpedance, which breaks you down into muscle, fat, and fluid. So we can qualify in this Paleolithic approach whether or not your metabolism is responding well or not. So everything we do in the office is always based on physical exam, laboratory assessments, and neurological assessment as well too. But the Paleolithic approach as a background in looking at a template for looking at nutrition is part of what I embrace. So I hope that was helpful. This is Dr. Richard Herbold, and you can join me at Capital District Vitality Center. And thanks again for your time.